The species question had come up in a novel way.
We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. Edward Bernays. But as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? The case at present must remain inexplicable, and may be truly argued as a valid argument against the views here entertained. Charles Darwin. His general theory that all life on Earth had originated and evolved by a gradual, successive accumulation of fortuitous mutations is still, as it was in Darwin's time, a highly speculative hypothesis, entirely without direct factual support, and very far from that self-evident axiom some of its more aggressive advocates would have us believe. Michael Denton, Evolution, A Theory in Crisis.
There was Herophilus, a physiologist who identified the brain rather than the heart as the seat of intelligence. There was Archimedes, the greatest mechanical genius until the time of Leonardo da Vinci. And there was the astronomer Ptolemy, who compiled much of what today is the pseudoscience of astrology. His Earth-centered universe held sway for 1,500 years, showing that intellectual brilliance is no guarantee against being dead wrong.
Episode 1 introduced a simple fact, that there are immense odds, bordering on the impossible, against anything intelligent ever arising out of chance and random processes alone. But despite this fact, the Darwinian theory of evolution puts forth a belief system that all of existence arose in this manner. The theory and its adherents have led many to accept a series of wild suppositions. Many now believe these leaps of faith are proven facts. The chance that higher life forms might have emerged by chance is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Fred Hoyle. The complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such an object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. The evolutionary materialists, modern Western intellectuals, and institutions around the world propose now that the universe and all of life arose only by a series of remarkable accidents. They believe and teach that all of life arose and was aided along, refined only by mutations in DNA, copying errors. The secret of DNA's success is that it carries information like that of a computer program, but far more advanced. Since experience shows that intelligence is the only presently acting cause of information, we can infer that intelligence is the best explanation for the information in DNA. Jonathan Wells. They point to a brute pursuit and contest for survival, ever churning, killing off the weak and allowing the strong to live on and feed off of them. This worldview is stark. The alternative is the age-old belief which is still held by the majority of the world, being that life is in fact divine. The likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts after it. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other, and if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. But our ways of learning about the world are strongly influenced by the social preconceptions and biased modes of thinking that each scientist must apply to any problem. The stereotype of a fully rational and objective scientific method, with individual scientists as logical and interchangeable robots, is self-serving mythology. Stephen Jay Gould. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Fred Hoyle. Darwin and Alfred Wallace's original ideas and theories have themselves been adopted and evolved over the years and spread across the modern world. Their ideas helped establish a new scientific, materialist, atheistic dogma which greatly influenced humanity. The evidence in this universe for design, or if you will, the fine-tuning that cannot be explained by chance or by enough time, is so compelling that the only way around it is to suggest that our universe is only one of an infinite number of universes. Dennis Prager. It is crazy to postulate a trillion causally unconnected universes to explain the features of one universe when postulating one entity, God, will do the job. Richard Swinburne. Natural selection is a theory of local adaptation to changing environments. It proposes no perfecting principles, no guarantee of general improvement. Stephen Jay Gould. Many now preach with certainty that the universe, life, and all the various forms of species came to be without any God. Neither men would have likely gone so far in their conclusions, however. The modern materialists preach nothing is divine, that God is fantasy. They propose that evolutionary theory is correct, and that it disproves the existence of any higher power or intelligent creator at play. They believe rather than divine intention and creation, all known varieties of life were achieved through the proposed transformative power of natural selection instead. On the spiritual theory, man consists essentially of a spiritual nature or mind, intimately associated with a spiritual body or soul, both of which are developed in and by means of a material organism. Alfred Russel Wallace. In the science, evolution is a theory about changes. In the myth, it is a fact about improvements. C.S. Lewis. Occam's razor. No more things should be presumed to exist than are absolutely necessary, i.e., the fewer assumptions an explanation of a phenomenon depends on, the better the explanation. William of Ockham. Here is the cosmological proof of the existence of God. The design argument of Paley, updated and refurbished. The fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie evidence of deistic design. Take your choice. Blind chance that requires multitudes of universes, or design that requires only one. Many scientists, when they admit their views, incline toward the teleological or design argument. Edward Robert Harrison.
Opposition to Darwinian theory is, I wouldn't say widespread, but there's a consistent group of people among mathematicians, among physicists, among some very good speculative biologists who simply don't accept it, don't even regard it as a scientific theory in any reasonable sense.
The modern materialists preach nothing is divine, that God is fantasy. They propose that evolutionary theory is correct, and that it disproves the existence of any higher power or intelligent creator at play. To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. Charles Darwin, On the Origin of Species. About weak points of the origin, I agree. The eye to this day gives me a cold shudder, but when I think of the fine known gradations, my reason tells me I ought to conquer the cold shudder. Charles Darwin. But what does the fossil record have to say? What could the effects of these two opposing belief systems each have had upon us? How realistic is the popular evolutionary model, given the world that we actually see and the fossil record we have of what lived before us? Charles Darwin viewed the fossil record more as an embarrassment than as an aid to his theory. Stephen Jay Gould. Naturalists must remember that the process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. A knowledge of paleontology is therefore a prerequisite. Only paleontology can provide them with the evidence and reveal its course or mechanisms.
Because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. I would say that the most outstanding, the salient points are, first of all, the fossil record, which is simply mystifying.
The Cambrian explosion or Cambrian radiation was an event approximately 541 million years ago, in the Cambrian period, when practically all major animal phyla started appearing in the fossil record. It lasted for about 13 to 25 million years and resulted in the divergence of most modern metazoan phyla. The event was accompanied by major diversifications in other groups of organisms as well. Before the Cambrian explosion, most organisms were relatively simple, composed of individual cells, or small multicellular organisms, occasionally organized into colonies. As the rate of diversification subsequently accelerated, the variety of life became much more complex and began to resemble that of today. Almost all present-day animal phyla appeared during this period. The fossil record had caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion, the coincident appearance of almost all complex organic designs. Stephen Jay Gould, The Panda's Thumb. Paleontologists ever since Darwin have been searching, largely in vain, for the sequences of insensibly graded series of fossils that would stand as examples of the sort of wholesale transformation of species that Darwin envisioned as the natural product of the evolutionary process. Few saw any reason to demur, though it is a startling fact that most species remain recognizably themselves, virtually unchanged throughout their occurrence in geological sediments of various ages. Niles Eldridge. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualist accounts of evolution. While many scientists have commented about the missing links in the fossil record, H.S. Ladd of UCLA observes, most paleontologists today give little thought to fossiliferous rocks older than the Cambrian, thus ignoring the most important missing link of all. Indeed, the missing Precambrian record cannot properly be described as a missing link, for it is in reality about 9/10 of the chain of life, the first 9/10. Geological Society of America Memoir, Volume 2. Eldridge and Gould certainly would agree that some very important gaps really are due to imperfections in the fossil record. Very big gaps too. For example, the Cambrian strata of rocks, vintage about 600 million years, are the oldest ones in which we find most of the major invertebrate groups. And we find many of them already in an advanced state of evolution the very first time they appear. It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Needless to say, this appearance of sudden planting has delighted creationists. Richard Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker. There is another and allied difficulty which is much more serious. I allude to the manner in which many species and several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. Most of the arguments which have convinced me that all of the existing species of the same group are descended from a single progenitor apply with nearly equal force to the earliest known species. For instance, it cannot be doubted that all the Silurian trilobites are descended from some one crustacean, which must have lived long before the Silurian age, and which probably differed greatly from any known animal. Some of the most ancient Silurian or Cambrian animals, as the nautilus, lingula, etc., do not differ much from living species, and it cannot, on our theory, be supposed that these old species were the progenitors of all the species belonging to the same groups, which have subsequently appeared, for they are not in any degree intermediate in character. Consequently, if the theory be true, it is indisputable that before the lowest Silurian or Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, as long as, or probably far longer than the whole interval from the Cambrian age to the present day, and that during these vast periods the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods, I can give no satisfactory answer. The difficulty of assigning any good reason for the absence beneath the Upper Cambrian formations of vast piles of strata rich in fossils is very great. It does not seem probable that the most ancient beds have been quite worn away by denudation, or that their fossils have been wholly obliterated by metamorphic action. For if this had been the case, we should have found only small remnants of the formations next succeeding them in age, and these would always have existed in a partially metamorphosed condition. But the descriptions which we possess of the Silurian deposits over immense territories in Russia and in North America do not support the view that the older a formation is, the more it has invariably suffered extreme denudation and metamorphism. Darwin adamantly declared that his theory could take no sudden leaps. He knew that large-scale variations inevitably resulted in deformity or death. Louis Agassiz, the leading paleontologist of Darwin's day, put it this way: "It is a matter of fact that extreme variations finally degenerate or become sterile. Like monstrosities, they die out." Yet, these Cambrian animals seemingly came out of nowhere. Of our 27 different phyla, or macro-level animal classifications, at least 20 of them appear in the geological strata suddenly, not gradually as Darwin's theory demands, hence the name Cambrian explosion. Darwin, however, was confident that future discoveries would vindicate his theory. Future geological discoveries have since come, yet these discoveries continue to present fatal objections to his theory. The introduction of a variety of organisms in the early Cambrian, including such complex forms of the arthropods as the trilobites, is surprising. The introduction of abundant organisms in the record would not be so surprising if they were simple. Why should such complex organic forms be in rocks about 600 million years old and be absent or unrecognized in the records of the preceding 2 billion years? If there has been evolution of life, the absence of the requisite fossils in the rocks older than the Cambrian is puzzling. Marshall K. and Edwin H. Colbert. This worldview is stark, the alternative being that life is in fact divine, beautiful, designed, the living works of God, all of it. At our very core, our essence and that of the universe, one in some sense. The fact, not theory, that evolution has occurred, and the Darwinian theory as to how it occurred, have become so confused in popular opinion that the distinction must be stressed. George Gaylord Simpson. Spiritual and religious people have always understood that the universe is the result of God, or the divine, an incredible, powerful, mysterious intelligence, force, or being, likely all being the manifestation out of love and wisdom, which goes beyond words and human notions, but nonetheless sustains, instructs, inspires, and beckons us ever higher and closer toward it, an understanding of our divine grounding. The equivocation fallacy happens when someone uses the same word to mean two or more different things. A fantastic example of this is evolution, which actually can mean microevolution or macroevolution. Micro being the small changes we see in creation due to genetic mutations and adaptations, which is observable in nature. Macro is the change from species to a new and distinct species, goo to you, which is not observable in nature. So a fallacy would be, we know we evolved from apes because we see birds evolving differently shaped beaks. That's equivocation, as the meaning of evolving changed the second time it was used. The Cambrian period thought to have started 540 million years ago, is a huge evolutionary enigma. Supposedly nothing but blue-green algae and bacteria lived for billions of years. And then, in a geologic instant, all of the major types of animals sprung into existence. This has been called the Big Bang of biology. No real progress has been made by evolutionists since Darwin's day, and the Cambrian evolutionary explosion is still shrouded in mystery. Now is Aldridge, the monkey business. The Cambrian explosion so flies in the face of evolution that paleontologist Peter Ward wrote, "If ever there was evidence suggesting divine creation, surely the Precambrian and Cambrian transition, known from numerous localities across the face of the earth, is it." Note that Ward is not a creationist. To his credit, the late evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould conceded to this point. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils.
We can't make much sense of the fossil record. It does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian theory, and it doesn't seem to sustain anything else as far as I can see. It's a perfectly mystifying record. That's one obvious point. I'm not talking just about the Cambrian explosion. I'm talking about everything that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the fossil record.
The phenomenon of sudden appearances in the fossil record is not just an exceptional case, say as in the Cambrian explosion, but actually is a pattern that is found everywhere. It is beginning with the very origin of life. It goes up to the origin of human culture. It is found in all periods of Earth history. It is found in all geographical regions, and it's found over all taxonomical categories, from plants and protists to invertebrate and vertebrate animals. So it's a clear pattern that cries out for an explanation. I could give you dozens of examples of such sudden appearances, and in every group you look into, you will find more examples. Some examples for such sudden transitions would, for example, be the origin of life, the origin of photosynthesis, the so-called Avalon explosion, which is the origin of the strange Ediacaran biota, the Cambrian explosion, where all these animal body plants originated, then the so-called Great Ordovician biodiversification event. The next would be the Devonian Nekton Revolution and Odontode Revolution, and the Silurio-Devonian Terrestrial Revolution, which is the origin of land plants, the Carboniferous insect explosion, the Triassic explosions, which include origins of marine reptiles and of tetrapods like dinosaurs. Then we have the abominable mystery, as Darwin called it, the origin of flowering plants. We have the tertiary sudden origin of butterflies. We have the tertiary avian radiation, the origin of modern birds. We have the tertiary radiation of placental mammals. We have the Big Bang of the genus Homo. And last but not least, we have the sudden origin of human culture in the Upper Paleolithic human revolution. In the middle of the Carboniferous period, we find the first flying insects. And they are already differentiated into very different groups of modern flying insects. And it's not only groups that are considered by Darwinists as primitive, like mayflies and dragonflies. Actually, they are only primitive in the sense that they occupy branches in the reconstructed phylogenetic trees that are considered to be very early, but their anatomy is very complex, and they had complex eyes with a wonderful vision system and very complex flight apparatus. They could fly like a helicopter. So they were complex, but they are considered to be very early in evolution. But on the other hand, at the same time, we already find very advanced groups of insects, like the first beetles and the first wasps. And they had this miracle-like kind of development where the lava dissolves in the pupal stage into a kind of soup, and the whole anatomy is rearranged into this very different adult body plan. And the striking thing is there are no fossil precursors for that. There are no credible transitions. Just presto, this fully articulated marvels.
Darwin's prediction of rampant, albeit gradual, change affecting all lineages through time is refuted. The record is there, and the record speaks for tremendous anatomical conservatism. Change in the manner Darwin expected is just not found in the fossil record. Niles Eldredge. Genetics might be adequate for explaining microevolution, but microevolutionary changes in gene frequency were not seen as able to turn a reptile into a mammal or to convert a fish into an amphibian. Microevolution looks at adaptations that concern the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. The origin of species, Darwin's problem, remains unsolved. Scott F. Gilbert. The facts of microevolution, change within the species, do not suffice for an understanding of macroevolution, the theorized change from one species to another. Richard Goldschmidt.
The interesting argument about the whale, which is a mammal after all, it belongs to the same group of organisms as a dog, a human being, a chimpanzee, or a tiger. The interesting argument about a whale is that if its origins were land-based originally, then we have some crude way of assessing quantitatively, not qualitatively, but quantitatively, the scope of the project of transformation. The project is very simple. Let's put it in vividly accessible terms. You've got a cow. You want to teach it how to live all of its life in the open ocean, still retaining its air-breathing characteristics. What do you have to do from an engineering point of view to change the cow into a whale? This is crude, but it gives you the essential idea. Now, if the same question were raised with respect to a car, and you ask what would it take to change a car into a submarine, we would understand immediately it would take a great many changes. The project is a massive engineering project of redesign and adaptation. Well, the same question occurs with respect to that proverbial cow. Virtually every feature of the cow has to be changed, it has to be adapted. But since we know that life on Earth and life in the water are fundamentally different enterprises, we have some sense of the number of changes. Anytime a science avoids coming to grips with numbers, it's somehow immersing itself in perhaps an unavoidable, but certainly an unattractive miasma. Here's a chance actually to put some numbers on calculations. We're not talking about genetics, we're talking about simple numbers. The skin has to change completely. It has to become impermeable to water. That's one change. Breathing apparatus has to change. A diving apparatus has to be put in place. Lactation systems have to be designed. The eyes have to be protected. The hearing has to be altered. Salivary organs have to be changed. Feeding mechanisms have to be changed. After all, a cow eats grass, a whale doesn't. As I say, I've tried to do some of these calculations. The calculations are certainly not hard. But they're interesting because I stopped at 50,000. That is morphological changes. And don't forget, these changes are not independent. They're all linked. If you change an organism's visual system, you have to change a great many parts of its cerebellum, its cerebrum, its nervous system. All of these changes are coordinated. So when we're talking about an evolutionary sequence such as this, what's interesting about the cow to whale transition, and I'm just using this as an easily accessible idea. What's interesting about the cow to whale transition is that we can see a different environment is going to impose severe design constraints on a possible evolutionary sequence. How are these constraints met? If they're roughly 50,000. If they're 2 million constraints, how are those met? And what does this suggest about what we should see in the fossil record? To my way of thinking, if Darwinian hypotheses are correct, it should suggest an enormous plethora of animals, intermediary between, say, Ambulocetus and the next step. That won't solve all problems. One wants to know what's directing this change. If anything. But at least it will put it in the ballpark of a quantitative estimate, which is hardly ever done.
No fossil is buried with its birth certificate. That and the scarcity of fossils means that it is effectively impossible to link fossils into chains of cause and effect in any valid way. To take a line of fossils and claim that they represent a lineage is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story, amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. Henry G. The idea that one can go to the fossil record and expect to empirically recover an ancestor-descendant sequence, be it of species, genera, families, or whatever, has been and continues to be a pernicious illusion. Gareth J. Nelson. The phrase "the fossil record" sounds impressive and authoritative. As used by some persons, it becomes, as intended, intimidating, taking on the aura of esoteric truth as expounded by an elite class of specialists. But what is it really, this fossil record? Only data in search of interpretation. All claims to the contrary that I know, and I know of several, are so much superstition.
How are these constraints met? If they're roughly 50,000. If they're 2 million constraints, how are those met?